Hello again. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is. Let's start again. Hope I can get through this chapter without my voice going. Chapter 11, Control. But Doug, I told you the hat was expensive. That was why I wanted to wear it so badly, Jody pleaded. Yeah, well, I didn't know it was that expensive. You're just going to have to take it back. Doug was flipping the credit card statement from front to back as if the numbers would change before his eyes like magic if he did it hard enough. It's beyond 30 days. I don't know if they'll take it back. Then it's definitely coming out of your clothing allowance. I was thinking of letting you keep it out of the goodness of my heart, but not now. I think you manipulated this whole thing. Waiting beyond the grace period was over, so you'd have to keep it. Well, just consider it your birthday present. His logic was so convoluted she couldn't follow it. If she had to pay for it out of her own clothing budget, then how could he make it a birthday present? It would be like she was buying her own present. On top of that, her birthday was still months away. I swear, Jody, you can spend money faster than anyone I know. Doug's remark was cut short as Dougie J bounded into the kitchen from the backyard. Doug tamped down his temper with the sight of his son, and his demeanor changed so fast it always astounded Jody how he could do it. It was like watching a barking bulldog become a mewing kitten in a heartbeat. It was also the only time Doug watched what he said to his wife. If one of their children ever did catch them having words, Doug wanted to make sure it looked like it was never his fault, but the one taking the metaphorical beating. Hey, buddy, having fun outside? Doug's tone was easygoing and playful. Uh-huh, he responded timidly, looking between parents. Mom, I'm hungry, he said. Can I have a peanut butter sandwich? Turning quickly so her son couldn't see the distress in her eyes, knowing she couldn't turn her emotions off as quickly as Doug could, she pretended to be looking for something in a utensil drawer. But you know Audra is going to watch you tonight, so your daddy and I can go out. And you can order pizza and have breadsticks? How about an apple? I just want a little sandwich, and apples make me more hungry, he begged. For God's sake, Jody, give the kid a sandwich, Doug snapped. Jody flinched at Doug's unaccustomed tone of voice in front of Dougie J. Dougie J gave his dad a quick, fearful look, startled by his tone. In order to continue to be a reasonable parent in his son's eyes, Doug bent down to Dougie's level. Cradling the invoices and budget book in his arms, he calmly said, Hey, kiddo, you eat your sandwich and maybe your mom and I have to leave. We'll play catch, okay? Okay, Dougie J answered. Fine, let me get these things put away, you eat, and I'll meet you in the backyard. He stood up and, without looking in Jody's direction, headed for the home office. Half an hour later, Doug walked into the bedroom as Jody stepped out of the shower. I want you to wear the navy blue dress, he stated definitively as he rummaged in his closet for his suit. But Doug, that dress is wool. It will be too hot for tonight. Jody, do we have to do this every time we go out? I'm wearing my brown suit, and your blue dress will go better with the tie I'm wearing. Besides, you know you look best in blue. His compliments always caught Jody by surprise. They were so infrequent she lapped them up the same way a dying man would lap up muddy water from a hole in the desert. Hoping his playing with Dougie J had soothed his mood, she was willing to do anything to keep him calm, even if it meant sweating throughout a dinner. Really? You think so? If you really think it looks best on me, then I will wear it. If it gets too hot, I'll just stand under the ceiling fan or something. That's a good girl. You just leave it to me. I know what looks best on you. This evening is too important to me, and I want to make sure you dress the part, since you know you don't have the same sense of flair as your sister. The insult was a little more subtle than his normal remarks, but still potent enough to have Jody's mood sink to the bottom of her chest as quickly as the water disappeared into that desert sand. Jody hated the annual employee appreciation dinners held every July. The food was always plentiful and delicious, but it also meant she had to spend the evening sitting through the boredom of dry speeches and making small talk with other wives she hardly knew. She always felt they were judging her, and she always fell short. After arriving at the function, she decided to stay by Doug's side, hoping she could avoid talking to them as long as she could. As they stood around waiting for the dinner to commence, she tried hard to look interested in the ever-persistent shop talk between Doug and his co-workers of prime rate stock prices and financial quotas. Fortunately, it only took half an hour of pretending to be engaged before the CFO approached the podium and announced over a microphone that dinner was being served and asked everyone to please find their seats. The crowd followed his instructions and found their assigned tables. It took a few moments for Doug to locate the table where he and Jody were to sit. He had automatically approached the table where his boss was sitting with the other upper executives, assuming it was where their assigned seats would be. He was confused to instead find the name of Mark Wilkinson, a young up-and-comer as his boss had called him. Upon discovering where they were seated, which was at a table a row over, Doug's mood went from professional courtesy to ill-hidden resentment, and he aimed this resentment toward Jody. 20 minutes into the dinner, the typical speeches for the evening began. Earlier than anyone expected and interrupting people eating their salads, Doug had been pushing the food around on his plate and tried to act as if the insult of sitting with people he considered his inferiors didn't affect him. Jody tried to lighten his mood by commenting on trivial aspects of the party, but animosity leached through his skin like sweat. "Just look how beautiful the flowers are," she tried. Doug murmured a response. Next to Jody, a woman overly made up caught her attention. "I just love your dress. The color really suits you." "Thank you. I thought it might be too warm, but fortunately they've got the air conditioner just right." "They always have the room too cold in here every year. I know they want to accommodate the massive body heat this party stirs up, but every year I have to bring a wrap." Another woman across from the made-up matron decided to join in. "Last year I actually had to borrow my husband's suit jacket." "Well, I guess it was good I wore wool then, because I honestly can't remember it being cold last year," Jody laughed. The three women talked and laughed, and Jody found herself having a really good time, forgetting Doug's sour disposition and the reason behind it. At one point, one of the women leaned forward to address Doug. "Are you having a good time, Mr. Warren?" Doing all but completely ignoring her, he groaned out an obligatory response gruffly, looking over her head in a form of deliberate dismissal as he said, "Yes, it's fine." The woman's eyes took on a look of confusion and insult as she jerked her head back like a surprised chicken. "Well," she said under her breath. Jody was never so happy to have the conversation interrupted as the bank president took the podium and made a polite request for silence. He proceeded to give the welcoming introduction and congratulatory comments expected of him. He thanked everyone on a successful year, announced that the evening was meant to be spent enjoying the successes of the individual departments, and for the managers, at least for the evening, to ignore the current economic downturn and the effects it could have on their business. The underlying meaning was obvious to no one but the managers, who knew that their promotions were directly linked to the success of their departments. The year had proved to be particularly difficult for some, since their financial goals had not been met. They tried to pretend the night wasn't about the bottom line, but the not-so-sly remark by the president and sideways looks between department heads made the individual department managers nervous. Doug's face took on an ashen pallor, but Jody, trying to desperately ignore the obvious competitiveness between the managers, returned to the camaraderie of her new friends. As the bank president sat back down, giving the party a short break before the next speaker, Jody nibbled on the last of the green beans on her plate. "You know, this is a really good meal this year, don't you think so?" she asked Doug, hoping to diffuse his obvious ire. Yeah, sure. His dismissal of her wasn't lost on Jody. "You're not eating your green beans, though. Don't you like them?" "No, I do. I'm just taking my time," he responded as he once again looked over at the head table. "They're coming around to pick up the plates. You should try and finish." I will, ignoring his fellow table mates. Jody set her fork down and turned to see the waitstaff picking up the plates at the next table. Leaning over slightly, Jody said to Doug, "If you don't want your beans, can I have them?" Turning abruptly back to Jody, Doug snapped, "Leave my meal alone. I'll eat them when I'm ready. When you make the money in this family, then you can make the decision on the food. Understand?" Jody turned back to the heavily made woman, hoping no one had heard Doug's outburst, and pretended his comment didn't cut her to the quick. To make his point, he picked up his plate over his right shoulder and snapped his fingers at the waiter. "You can take my plate now." Wiping his mouth with his napkin, he put it on the table with a slap, turned in his seat with his back to Jody, and feigned anticipation of the upcoming speeches. Throughout the endless array of speeches, Doug kept sneaking glances in the direction of his boss as he sat next to the president and CFO and the much younger, less experienced man sitting with them, Mark Wilkinson. Story was that Mark had a double master's in finance and economics, but rumor had it he was a nephew of one of the executives in the home office. Whatever the reason didn't matter. Someone had intentionally replaced Doug with Mark at the elite table. It was a deliberate snub to Doug. And to add insult to injury, he and Jody had ended up sitting with people he didn't even know. As dessert was handed out, Doug fumed more to himself than to Jody, but loud enough for her to hear him. I'm going to find out who made up the seating arrangements if it's the last thing I do. Jody cringed and sighed, knowing where the rest of the evening was going. As the speeches wore on with the tediousness of a toothache, Jody decided to make the best of what was left of the evening, knowing nothing she did would lighten Doug's mood. She tried to enjoy her dessert and coffee and not let out the overbearing competitiveness of the people around her ruin one of the few nights out she got a year, even if it was this particular event. She would listen politely and applaud when necessary and ignore her husband's surliness with hopeful determination that it would all end soon. As the long-winded executives finally decided they had spoken long enough, music started up and dishes were quickly being removed from the tables. Jody turned her head to ask Doug if they were staying for the dancing when she saw his assistant walk up to them and stop behind Doug. "Hello, Mrs. Warren." "Leona, hi. How are you?" "Fine, thank you." "Hi, Mr. Warren." Leona had adroitly situated herself between Doug and Jody, slightly turning her back to Jody. Doug turned his head when he heard his name. Leona was standing so close to his side, his face almost brushed her right breast when he turned to look up at her. The hint of roses wafted across the table whenever she moved. "Hello, Leona. The music is starting up, and I wondered if I could have the first dance with you." She had a girlish little voice that always reminded Jody of a 12-year-old. "I'm not much of a dancer, I'm afraid. I don't think I'd be able to keep up with you." "Oh, come on, Mr. Warren. It'll be fun. If you like, we can dance to something a little slower." The syrup in her voice was thick within your window. Turning her head slightly to her left, Leona addressed Jody over her shoulder, never taking her eyes off Doug. "You don't mind if I steal your husband from you, do you, Mrs. Warren?" "No, of course not. Doug, you should dance. I'm going to get a glass of wine, and I'll find you when the dance is over." Downing the last of his red wine, Doug stood, and with his hand at the base of her back, he escorted Leona to the dance floor, where a large majority of people were already heading. Leona was wearing a short, tight-fitting, white-capped sleeve dress with an unusual amount of sequins that reminded Jody of a dress out of a Vegas nightclub. The back had a diamond cutout that was so low that Doug's hand touched bare skin at the curve right above her butt. Jody entered the ballroom with a glass of wine a few moments later and spotted Doug and Leona dancing to Prince. She stood against a wall drinking her wine and watched them dance. It felt good to have a moment to herself. As the song finished, another one started up immediately on the last chord, and Leona grabbed Doug by the arm as he started to walk off the dance floor. Jody smiled at Doug's look of apprehension. Jody thought it was good for him to dance. Besides, as long as Leona kept him dancing, he couldn't drink. Thinking of how he was such an unpleasant drunk made her shudder a little as she tried to keep her mind from dredging up the night of Rob and Darcy's wedding. She had to admit there was a portion of the wedding she couldn't remember, but she did remember feeling disconnected and ashamed and the feeling had lasted for days. Jody watched Doug and Leona continue to dance as she let the anxiety of the green bean incident slide down her body along with the Pinot Grigio. The young administrative assistant was a petite 27-year-old with thick hair the color of a rusty bucket and boobs that seemed equivalent to her IQ. She had gotten the job at the bank after getting an associate's degree at the community college in some sort of administrative training. She had been Doug's assistant for just over a year, and Jody had gotten to know her from brief phone calls and company get-togethers like the one they were at tonight. As Jody watched Doug and Leona on the dance floor, she noticed with each sway of the music, Leona's hips got a little closer to Doug, and Doug appeared to be a little less uncomfortable with each gyration. Strangely, Jody didn't mind. The wine was beginning to work its soothing effects on her system, and she decided to find a seat against a far wall just sit and watch people dance. Deciding to sit next to a large potted ficus that half hid her from the other guests, she sat and listened to the music, fascinated by the swirl of colored dresses of the women and the vibration from the music reverberating off the walls. She watched in silence and pretended she was camouflaged with the plant which kept her protected from the chaos of the scene. With a relaxed calm, Jody leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes as she let the rhythms from the band float around her like frantic snowflakes. Her left arm lay across her stomach and supported her right hand that held her wine. The position was natural and comfortable. The warmth of her blue wool dress and the wine were beginning to engulf her in heat, as if she were wrapped in a soft blanket, and the secluded spot in the room made her feel safe. In a few moments she drifted into a peaceful, welcome nap, with quick dreams darting in and out of her mind. She woke with a sudden little jerk just before her wine glass fell from her hand. She didn't know how long she'd been asleep, but the music had ended. The band was on a break, and she looked up to see Doug surrounded by co-workers with what looked to be a tequila sunrise in his hand. She was worried he might have been looking for her, so she stood up from her chair to get a better look at his face. As she stood to survey the situation, Leona appeared at her side. "Mrs. Warren, are you enjoying the party?" The question seemed to come out of her mouth in slow motion, and Jody could tell her speech was altered by what smelled like gin. "Yes, thank you. Are you having fun?" "Oh, yes. I just love parties and dancing. I'd dance every night if I could." "You're still young enough that you should go out dancing as much as you can." "Oh, I know, and I want to thank you for letting me dance with Mr. Warren all night. He's really better than he thinks he is." "That's good to hear." Jody was responding without really paying attention to the conversation. "You know, everyone thinks he's just the best boss. He's always fair to everyone and never gets mad at anything. I mean, the other day, last Tuesday I think it was, we found out that our department hadn't met our yearly goal, and it could affect everyone's raises, especially Mr. Warren's. We were all kind of worried and walked on eggshells all day, but you know, Mr. Warren didn't even get mad or anything. In fact, he never said a word about it. We think he doesn't blame anyone in particular, and is why he didn't get upset, because he knows we all work as hard as we can." Jody turned and finally looked at Leona's face, not sure what to say. She remembered that Tuesday, Doug had come home in a foul mood. He had snapped at her all evening and complained about the veal she'd made for dinner. And in a rare moment of temper, he had yelled at Lexi for being on the phone too long. She'd been glad it had been her night off of having sex. She hated having sex with him when he was in a bad temper. The sex was always rushed and unpleasant. With a slight clearing of her throat to hide the pause in the conversation, Jody responded to Leona in the only way she knew how. "Oh, well, I'm sorry about the goal problem, and I'm sure you're right. Doug doesn't blame anyone. I'm sure it will be better next year." "Oh, sure, I know it will." Jody had turned her eyes back to Doug as she listened out of the corner of her ear to Leona's prattling. Suddenly, like a shadow passing before her eyes, Doug turned and gave her a look, letting her know he'd seen her asleep. A slight shiver of misgiving scampered down Jody's skin. At the same moment, Leona finished her sentence. "You must feel so lucky to be married to such a good man." Lucky to be married. Leona's choice of words had conjured up a memory that had been buried deep into Jody's subconscious. One she thought she'd forgotten. Slowly, as if the lights had been turned down in the room, Jody's eyes went from the scene in front of her to a dark past only she could see. It had been her wedding day. She and Doug had had a day of dancing and laughing. The guests were all happy and wishing them well. Then, right before they left the reception for the downtown Hyatt, where they'd spend their first night as husband and wife, her father had taken her aside. In a pretense of giving her a loving hug, he told her in her ear, "Don't mess this up, girl. You know you don't have a lot going for you, and it's taken all your mother and I've got to make sure you're settled well. So you just make sure you abide by those vows you just spoke to obey your husband. You hear me? You just consider yourself lucky to be married to such a good man, and mind your step." With that, he gave her a hard squeeze, while the onlooking guests gave an audible ah, thinking he was hugging her out of love. Jody had just stared at her dad as her mood went from one of happy optimism to self-loathing and doubt. Her father had just told her she had nothing going for her, and if this very good man hadn't married her, then what else did she have? It was the beginning of a vow she made to herself at that moment, to always obey her husband, always, so she would give him no reason to be disappointed in her like her father was. Leona was still talking as Jody slowly came back to herself. Well, the band is starting up again, and I'm going to find a new partner. Oh, yes. Well, I think Doug is probably looking for me. It was nice talking to you, Leona. Yes, you too, Mrs. Warren. Talk to you later. Bye. Leona was already making a beeline to a handsome young man in a brown suit by the time she'd said her bye to Jody. Jody tentatively walked over to Doug. As she approached him, he turned his attention from the man he was speaking to. Oh, Jody, there you are. I want to introduce you to Mr. Peterson. He's director of the sales in the downtown office. He gave her a look to let her know he wasn't happy with her. She hid her unease of his look by turning her attention to the man beside him. Hello, Mr. Peterson. It's nice to meet you. Mrs. Warren, it's nice to meet you. Aren't you lovely in blue? Jody was dubious, but hid it behind a polite remark. Thank you. How very kind of you. Are you here with your wife? Sadly, no, she couldn't make it. Oh, that's a shame. I hope you're enjoying yourself anyway. I would enjoy myself more if I had a dancing partner, and Doug tells me you're quite the dancer. Would you mind giving me the honor? Dance? Jody thought. Doug always knew she wasn't a very good dancer. Oh, well, I assure you he flatters me more than I deserve. Well, I'll take my chances if you will. After slight hesitation, she joked, All right, then. I'd be happy to dance with you. But don't say I didn't warn you. Yes, go ahead and dance with him, honey. I'm going to get myself another drink. Jody noticed Doug's voice was on the razor edge of being slurred, and she noticed his eyes were red. Of course, Jody hid her concern behind a mask of pleasantry. Do you mind holding my glass? She looked Doug directly in the eye to try and gauge his mood. Mr. Peterson took Jody's hand and led her onto the dance floor. And please, call me Derek. Jody let herself be led onto the floor while her mind fretted over Doug seeing her asleep against the wall. With the dance ending and Jody thanking Mr. Peterson, she found Doug at the edge of the dance floor talking to his boss, John Erickson. I'm sorry about the mix-up with the tables, Doug. The caterer had gotten the names from my assistant and mixed up the envelopes. I'd wanted you sitting with me at the table so I could discuss next year's plans with you. I just want you to know you have nothing to worry about. Everybody's numbers are low this year, but you've been doing a great job. Your bonus should reflect that. As if a spotlight had been directed to frame Doug's face, Jody watched the light in his eyes go from apprehension to relief and then joy. Speaking casually, Doug responded with the professional lying he had mastered. I didn't give it a thought, John. Really, I didn't even notice. But I do appreciate you telling me. Yes, well, I thought you should know. In fact, I'd like you in San Francisco next week to help get the new branch in order. Can you do that? You bet. Anything I can do. Doug's happy change of demeanor reminded Jody of a puppy wagging its tail when getting a treat. Now, enough shop talk. You should dance with your wife and enjoy the rest of the party. Turning to Jody, John Erickson took her left hand, cradled it softly in both of his, and said, Mrs. Warren, nice to see you again. Doug is one lucky man. Have a good evening. With that, he slid his hand across the top of hers and disappeared into the crowd as Jody blushed. Did you hear that? Doug said rhetorically. Man, he just made my year. Doug's enthusiasm had reversed the sour disposition he'd carried all night, like Atlas throwing off the weight of the world. Doug was in such a good mood after his talk with Mr. Erickson, he closed down the party with enough drinks to fuel several people and danced every song with whatever woman was close enough to agree, which most of the time was Leona. Okay, stopping there for now. See you later.